The gavel hadn't fallen yet. But everybody in that auction yard, every sunburned face, every pressed banker's collar, every neighbor who'd come to watch, they all knew it was coming. It was October 14th, 1978, Millard County, Utah, and a 71-year-old man named Eldon Pruett was standing in the dirt driveway of a farm he had worked for 43 years, watching strangers walk through his barn like they already owned it. His hands were at his sides, his jaw was set, and there was something in his eyes, something none of those bankers or auction house men had thought to look for. He wasn't scared. He was waiting. Let me tell you about central Utah in the fall of 1978. The Great Basin stretches out there like God took the rest of the country and ironed it flat, sage and alkaline soil, and mountains so old they've forgotten what it felt like to be sharp. The air smells like juniper and cold coming down from the Pavant Range. By October, the days are short and the light is amber and thin, and it cuts across the fields at an angle that makes everything look like it's already a memory. Fillmore, Utah, population under 4,000. The kind of town where the diner opens at 5 a.m. because the farmers don't sleep much past 4, where you know your banker's father and your banker knows your grandfather, and somehow that familiarity has never quite translated into mercy. The Pruett farm sat 7 miles southwest of town, off a dirt road that didn't have a name on any map. 1,100 acres, dry-farmed wheat and alfalfa, a small beef operation, 2 irrigation pivots that Eldon had installed in 1963 when the county agent told him he was crazy for trying. The farmhouse was white clapboard with a green metal roof. The barn was older than the house. The equipment shed had been added piece by piece, year by year, the way a man adds things when he can't afford to build what he actually needs. By the fall of 1978, there was a notice stapled to the front gate. Notice of trustees' sale. 4 words that had broken better men than Eldon Pruett. The late 1970s were eating American agriculture alive. Interest rates were climbing, the prime rate would hit 20% within 2 years, grain prices were volatile. The 1976 drought had burned through the Southwest like a slow fire, and the banks, sensing blood, had called in loans on farms across Millard County, the way a card player lays down his hand with a smile and without apology. Eldon owed $214,000 to the First Consolidated Bank of Fillmore, Utah. He had missed 3 payments. The bank had accelerated the note, and on the morning of October 14, 1978, a man named Gerald Hatch was running the auction. Let me tell you about Eldon Pruett. He was born in 1907 in Sanpete County, Utah, the son of a dry farmer and the grandson of Mormon pioneers who had come to the valley in the 1860s and found it hostile and stayed anyway. He grew up during the Depression with a father who spoke rarely and worked constantly, and he inherited both qualities completely. He was a short man, 5'7" in his boots, with hands so large and calloused they looked like they belonged to someone twice his size. He'd married his wife Dawn in 1936, and they'd raised 4 children on that farm, 2 boys and 2 girls. Dawn had passed in 1971. Eldon hadn't moved a thing in the bedroom since. He was not a man who talked about feelings. He was not a man who talked much at all. What he was, and what the people who actually knew him would tell you if you asked, was a man who paid attention to weather, to soil, to machinery, to the way a diesel engine changes its sound when something isn't right inside. He had gone to school through the 8th grade. He had never owned a new tractor until 1961, when he'd purchased a John Deere 4010, a machine he considered the finest piece of equipment ever built, and he'd maintained that tractor with a devotion that some men reserve for religion. He read, he subscribed to Successful Farming, Prairie Farmer, and the Utah Farm Bureau News. He kept a notebook, spiral-bound blue cover, in which he recorded precipitation, yields, equipment hours, and fuel costs going back to 1951. Every single year, 27 notebooks in a row, stacked on a shelf in the tack room. He had made mistakes. He had borrowed money in 1974 to expand the beef herd when cattle prices were high, and the cattle market had collapsed in 1975, the way markets do, suddenly and without apology. He'd been paying down that debt ever since, slowly, stubbornly, the way he did everything. And now the bank wanted its money, all of it, right now. That morning his oldest son, Carl, who farmed his own place in Sevier County, had driven 3 hours to stand beside him. Carl was 41 and looked it. He'd offered to help cover the debt. Eldon had told him no. "I'm not your burden to carry," he'd said. "Come watch if you want, but come to watch." Carl didn't understand what that meant. He would. Gerald Hatch was 52 years old, and he wore that age the way a man wears a good suit, comfortably, and with the assumption that you noticed. He was the vice president of First Consolidated Bank of Fillmore, and he had been since 1969, when the previous vice president had retired and Gerald had been the obvious choice because he was the previous VP's son-in-law, and because, it must be said, he was very good at the parts of banking that involve pressure. He drove a 1978 Buick Electra, brown with a tan vinyl roof, and he wore a bolo tie with a turquoise slide that he considered distinguished. He was a big man with a broad, flat face and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Gerald Hatch liked farm auctions. This is not a cruel thing to say, it is simply accurate. He liked them the way a chess player likes endgame, not out of malice necessarily, but out of a genuine appreciation for the moment when the position becomes inevitable. He liked the crowd. He liked the auctioneer. He liked the paperwork signed and clean that transferred a problem from his balance sheet to someone else's name. He had run 6 farm foreclosures in Millard County in the past 18 months. He was good at them. That morning, standing outside the Pruett barn with a cup of coffee from the diner, he had looked over the equipment with his colleague, a young loan officer named Dennis Whitfield, who was 27, and still believed that everything Gerald Hatch said was either true or going to be. Sad situation, Dennis said, looking at the fields. Inevitable situation, Gerald corrected. Man borrowed money he couldn't service. The land'll go to somebody who can use it right. He had already identified the buyer, a farming operation out of Juab County that ran 12,000 acres and needed more. The price had been discussed, not formally but discussed, the way these things get discussed. As the auction crowd gathered, maybe 60 people, a mix of neighbors, equipment dealers, land speculators, and the merely curious, Gerald circulated. He shook hands. He told a joke about the price of wheat that landed softly. He looked to everyone watching like a man at ease. He glanced at Eldon Pruett once. Eldon was standing by the equipment shed with Carl, looking at something inside it. Gerald couldn't tell what. He didn't worry about it. He should have. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room, or a field, or a parking lot, where the power was so completely on one side that the other person almost didn't seem real, where the outcome was so certain that the whole event felt like a formality, like the clock was just running down? That's what the auction yard felt like at 10 o'clock that morning. The auctioneer, a man named Roy Telford from Delta, Utah, who did agricultural auctions across 3 counties, had set up his podium near the barn. The equipment was laid out in the yard for inspection: 2 irrigation pumps, a set of disc harrows, a grain auger, a hay swather, a 1968 John Deere 4020, and various hand tools and shop equipment. Also listed in the sale, the land, all 1,100 acres, the farmhouse, the outbuildings. The whole thing. Roy Telford was walking through the terms, the order of sale, the deposit requirements, the transfer timeline, and most of the crowd was half listening the way people do when they already know how a story ends. Gerald Hatch moved through the crowd and came to stand near Eldon, not beside him, near him, in the way that a man establishes a thing without saying it directly. Eldon, he said, the tone of a man extending a courtesy. Gerald, Eldon said. He didn't look at him. You know, there was a point 6 months ago, maybe 8, where we could have worked something out. Gerald paused. He meant this to be generous, the review of a path not taken. I tried to get you to the table. You tried to get me to sign over the mineral rights as additional collateral, Eldon said, quietly and without heat. That's not the same thing. Gerald's expression didn't change. Well, water under the bridge. Yep. A silence between them. Roy Telford's voice droned on. You got any family coming? Gerald asked. He was looking at the crowd. Looks like Carl's here. Carl's here. That's good. Family should be together at a time like this. He said it with the gentleness of a man twisting a knife slowly. Eldon said nothing. Dennis Whitfield had drifted over and was standing just behind Gerald's shoulder. He was young enough that he didn't know how to make his face neutral, and what was on it, if you looked closely, was something almost like pity. He looked at the old man's barn. He looked at the green metal roof of the farmhouse. Nice place, he said, meaning it. 43 years, Eldon said. He said it the way you state a fact, not a complaint. Gerald Hatch looked at his watch. "Roy's going to start in about 10 minutes. If there's anything you'd like to retrieve from the house before, personal items, that sort of thing, now would be the time." And there it was. That was the thing he'd come over to say, not the pleasantries. The gentle, polished suggestion that Eldon Pruett go get his keepsakes and clear out of the way while the real business happened. Eldon looked at Gerald Hatch for the first time. "I'll be right here," he said. Something in Gerald Hatch's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not worry, not quite. More like a man who has noticed an unexpected variable and is choosing for now to ignore it. He nodded. He walked back to the podium area. Carl leaned close to his father. "What are we doing, Dad?" Eldon didn't answer right away. He looked out at the equipment yard, at the grey October sky, at the mountains to the west with their first dusting of snow. "Waiting," he said. "Now I need to take you back, not far, just about 6 weeks. Because the story of what happened that morning at the Pruett auction didn't begin at the auction. It began on a Saturday in late August, in a machine shed in Nephi, Utah, 90 miles to the north. Eldon Pruett had driven up there to look at a piece of equipment. He'd seen the listing in the back pages of the Deseret News classified section, a 1952 Allis-Chalmers all-crop harvester, Model 60, with a 12-foot grain header, listed for $400. The man selling it was 70 years old and getting out of farming, and he wanted it gone more than he wanted what it was worth. Now, most people in 1978 would have laughed at a 1952 all-crop 60. It was 26 years old. It was the kind of machine that younger farmers used as a story. "My granddad had one of those," or "those things were a nightmare." The AC all-crop was a pull-type combine, meaning it was towed behind a tractor rather than self-propelled, and by the late 1970s, pull-types were considered obsolete by anyone who considered themselves modern. But Eldon Pruett had used an all-crop 60 for 11 years. He knew them the way a surgeon knows a specific tool. He knew the cylinder speed, 1050 RPM, and the concave clearance settings for wheat versus soybeans versus millet. He knew that the straw walkers on the 60 were actually superior in rocky, uneven terrain to many self-propelled machines, because the lower center of gravity reduced separation losses on hillside ground. He knew something else too. In 1978, in the drought-stressed, short-crop conditions of central Utah, where the wheat was thin and light and prone to shattering, an all-crop 60 set with a gentle cylinder and wide concave clearance would thresh clean without the grain loss that bigger, faster machines caused. He'd run the numbers in his blue spiral notebook. On a short crop, he estimated he could reduce combined losses by 6 to 9 bushels per acre with the old pull type, on his specific ground, with his specific variety of hard red winter wheat. On 400 harvestable acres, that was 2,400 to 3,600 additional bushels. At the September 1978 futures price of $3.48 per bushel, that was between $8,352 and $12,528 in grain that a modern combine would have thrown out the back. He bought the all-crop 60 for $375, talked the man down from $400, and drove it home behind his John Deere 4010. His neighbor, a man named Warren Bybee, had seen it in the yard and shaken his head. "Eldon, what in the world are you going to do with that antique?" "Harvest wheat," Eldon said. Warren had laughed, not unkindly, just the way you laugh when an old man says something that doesn't quite make sense. But here is what Eldon Pruett had understood that August, that nobody else in that valley had yet figured out. He wasn't trying to win the future. He just needed to survive the fall. He needed $214,000, or close enough to it that he could negotiate the rest. He had 380 acres of wheat still in the ground, planted on shares with a neighbor who would keep 60%, his 40% at a normal yield of 32 bushels per acre, on light soil in a dry year at current prices. He'd done the math 100 times. It was close, it was achingly, maddeningly close. And every bushel that a modern combine threw out the back was a bushel he couldn't get back. So he'd bought the old machine. And then he'd done something else. He'd called Gerald Hatch's office on September 3rd and asked for an extension to the foreclosure date. He'd asked for 60 days. Gerald Hatch had offered 30. 30 days, specifically timed, Eldon suspected, so that the sale date fell before the last of the wheat came off. October 14th. The forecast that week called for the first hard frost by October 20th. Eldon had exactly enough time, maybe. And so on the morning of the auction, while Gerald Hatch circulated and shook hands and looked at his watch, Eldon Pruett's equipment shed held something that nobody in that auction yard had looked at closely enough to understand. A 1952 Allis-Chalmers all-crop 60, completely rebuilt, new belts, new cylinder bars, a freshly set concave, hitched and ready behind his 1961 John Deere 4010. He had spent 6 weeks restoring it, evenings and weekends and early mornings. He'd driven to 3 different salvage yards across 2 states for parts. He'd written to an Allis-Chalmers dealer in Illinois who still had a parts inventory. He was ready. But the auction was starting, and the wheat was still in the field. Roy Telford brought down his gavel on the first lot, the irrigation pumps, at 10:17 a.m. Eldon Pruett raised his hand. Gerald Hatch, standing 30 feet away, turned. Eldon bid on the irrigation pumps. He bid against a man from Delta who wanted them for a pivot operation, and he bid calmly, without hurry, and he won them at $1,800. Gerald Hatch watched this with an expression of polite confusion. Why was a man whose farm was being auctioned away bidding on pieces of his own equipment? Then Eldon bid on the disc harrows, won them. Then the grain auger. He was spending money the auctioneer was holding, money that would ultimately go back to the bank, but he was winning back his own tools. Gerald walked over quickly. Eldon, I have to point out, any amounts you spend here today come off what you owe, you can't. I know how auctions work, Eldon said. Then why? Because, Eldon said, the equipment's not for sale. Gerald stared at him. The equipment is mine, Eldon said quietly with complete steadiness, and I'm buying it back, because this specific auction, is missing something. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas work coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Yesterday afternoon, he said, I deposited $87,500 with the Utah Division of Banking as partial payment against the accelerated note. Under Utah Code annotated 57131, a partial cure of default in good faith suspends the foreclosure process pending arbitration, provided the amount constitutes a genuine and substantial portion of the outstanding obligation. He handed the paper to Gerald Hatch. Gerald took it. His face went through 3 different expressions in about 2 seconds. 41% of the outstanding balance, Eldon continued, is substantial. I looked it up. Where did you? Gerald started. He stopped. He looked at the paper again. I sold wheat, Eldon said. Now let me tell you what had happened in the last 3 weeks. From September 21st to October 11th, Eldon Pruett and his son Carl had run that 1952 Allis-Chalmers all-crop 60 across every harvestable acre of his wheat ground. They'd started before sunup every morning, the combine's header cutting low in the grey pre-dawn, the cylinder threshing quietly, the grain auger lifting the clean wheat into the wagon. They ran until the moisture content dropped below acceptable levels in the afternoon heat, then shut down and maintained until the dew allowed them to start again. It was slow. A modern self-propelled combine would have done the same acreage in a third of the time. But the all-crop 60, set perfectly, run deliberately, by a man who understood every gear and tooth and belt, was harvesting grain that a modern machine would have lost. 6 to 8 bushels per acre, just as Eldon had calculated. They pulled 11,240 bushels off 380 acres. In a drought year on dry farmed ground that was a remarkable number. The county average for that crop on comparable ground was around 9,100 bushels, meaning Eldon's careful, slow, old machine harvest had produced nearly 24% more than his neighbors got from faster equipment. He'd sold forward at $3.52 per bushel to a grain elevator in Holden through a broker his son Carl knew. The check had cleared on October 10th. $39,564.8 from his share of the wheat. But that wasn't the $87,500. Here is the part that Gerald Hatch's research team, the young man Dennis Whitfield, who had been thorough but not thorough enough, had missed. Eldon Pruett owned the mineral rights on his property. Gerald Hatch had tried to take them as collateral back in February and Eldon had refused. What Gerald's office had concluded, reasonably but incorrectly, was that the mineral rights were therefore unencumbered and worthless, because if they were worth something, Eldon would have used them. What Eldon knew, what he had known since 1971, when a geologist from the University of Utah had walked his back 40 and filled out a survey, was that a section of his property sat atop a saline aquifer with commercial potential for mineral extraction. Not oil, not gas, something quieter and more mundane, sodium sulfate, used in the pulp and paper industry and in the manufacture of detergent. He had contacted a minerals extraction company in Salt Lake City in September. They had offered him a lease, not a sale, of the mineral rights on 320 acres, for an upfront payment of $51,200 and a royalty agreement. He had signed it on September 29th. $51,200 plus $39,564 from the wheat. Total $90,764. He had kept $3,264 for operating expenses and deposited $87,500. Now let me pause and let you sit with that for a moment. A 71-year-old man with an 8th grade education, running a 26-year-old combine at 5 miles an hour in the early morning Utah dark, had outmaneuvered a bank, an auction, and a system designed to take everything he had. He had done it not with lawyers, though he talked to one, a woman in Provo named Patricia Shumway, who had confirmed the statute and charged him $200. He had done it not with family money. He had done it with a notebook full of numbers, a rebuilt machine nobody thought was worth rebuilding, and 43 years of paying attention to a piece of ground that other men had underestimated. Roy Telford had stopped the auction proceedings. He was on the phone in the barn. Gerald Hatch was reading the paper a second time, then a third. Dennis Whitfield stood very still, looking at the ground. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a crowd when the thing they expected to happen suddenly isn't happening. It isn't just quiet, it's the sound of people recalibrating, reassessing, looking at a man they'd been looking at all morning and seeing something different. Roy Telford came out of the barn and said, in a voice stripped of its auctioneer's rhythm, that the proceedings were being suspended pending review of documentation submitted to the Division of Banking. He said it clearly and without editorializing. He had run enough auctions to know when a sale was over. The crowd stirred, people leaned toward each other, 60 people, and the air between them suddenly full of murmuring. Gerald Hatch handed the paper back to Eldon. His face was controlled. He was a professional, and his professionalism held but just barely, and around the edges you could see the thing it was holding back. "This won't hold forever," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You know that." "I know it gives me 90 days minimum," Eldon said, "and I've got a crop of winter wheat going in next week." Gerald Hatch looked at him, really looked at him for the first time all morning. "That mineral lace," he said, "how long have you known about that?" Eldon considered this. "Long enough," he said. Carl Pruett, standing behind his father, was doing something that a 41-year-old man rarely allows himself to do in public. He was trying not to cry. The man from Millard County, the one who'd come to buy 1,100 acres at a favorable price, was already walking back to his truck. He had not said a word to anyone. He had simply recalculated, with the efficiency of a man who does large transactions, and determined there was nothing here for him today. Warren Bybee, the neighbor who had laughed at the old combine in the yard, was standing near the fence. He pushed his hat back on his head and looked at the equipment shed, at the all-crop 60 visible through the open door, and he shook his head slowly. But he was smiling. Dennis Whitfield walked over to his car. He sat in it for a long time without starting the engine. Roy Telford loaded his auctioneer's podium into his truck. He nodded at Eldon as he passed. "Good morning," Eldon said. "It surely is," Roy said. Gerald Hatch stood in the empty yard for a moment after everyone had moved. He straightened his bolo tie. He picked up his coffee cup from the fence post where he'd set it earlier. He walked to his Buick Electra without looking back. He drove away. The dust of the unpaved road rose and then settled. And there was Eldon Pruett, standing in the yard of his farm on a cold October morning in 1978, with the mountains behind him and the smell of diesel and sage in the air and 1,100 acres of land still in his name. Carl put a hand on his father's shoulder. Eldon nodded. That was all. Let me tell you what happened next, not just in the next few months, but in the years that followed, because that's where the real story lives. In December 1978, Eldon entered into a formal restructuring agreement with First Consolidated Bank of Fillmore. Patricia Shumway, the Provo attorney, negotiated terms that spread the remaining balance over 7 years at a fixed rate. Gerald Hatch was not involved in the negotiations. The bank's regional director came down from Salt Lake City to handle it personally. It was, by all accounts, an uncomfortable series of meetings. Gerald Hatch left First Consolidated Bank in the spring of 1980. The official story was that he retired. The unofficial story, which circulated through Millard County for years, was that the bank's review of the Pruett foreclosure had revealed procedural irregularities in how the extension request had been handled, specifically whether the 30-day offer constituted good faith dealing under Utah banking regulations. Nothing was ever formally pursued. But Gerald Hatch did not work in banking again. Dennis Whitfield left First Consolidated the same year. He went back to school. He became eventually an agricultural loan specialist, but one with a reputation among farmers as someone who actually read the files before he foreclosed. People who knew the story said he'd learned something in that yard in October 1978 that no business school had taught him. The mineral lease on Eldon's back section produced royalty income for 11 consecutive years. Total royalties paid over that period, $223,000. It was, in the end, worth considerably more than anyone, including Eldon, had expected. The Alice Chalmers All-Crop 60 sat in the equipment shed until 1982. Eldon ran it for 3 more harvests. In 1982, he donated it to the Utah State Fair agricultural exhibit, where it was displayed for several years as an example of mid-century small farm equipment. He kept the original manual and the set of wrenches he'd used to rebuild it. They're still in the tack room, on the same shelf as the spiral notebooks. Eldon Pruett lived on his farm until 1991. He died at 84 in the farmhouse with the green metal roof, with his son Carl in the next room and his daughter Ruth driving up from St. George. He had paid off the restructured loan in 1984, 3 years early. The farm passed to Carl and his brother Dale jointly, and they run a portion of it still. In 1983, Eldon gave a short talk at the Utah Farm Bureau annual meeting in Provo. He was not a public speaker, and the talk was brief, but one part of it has been quoted in the region ever since, passed from farmer to farmer the way useful things get passed. A bank, he said, will tell you your land is worth what they say it is. A machine will tell you it's old and finished. A year will tell you it's too late. None of them know your ground like you do. Don't let somebody else's arithmetic replace what you know. The room was quiet for a moment after he said it. Then they applauded. He sat down and looked uncomfortable and grateful in equal measure. There is one more piece to this story. In 2002, Carl Pruett's youngest daughter, a woman named Elise, who was 26 and finishing a master's degree in agricultural economics at Utah State University, wrote her thesis on dry farming efficiency in the Great Basin from 1970 to 1990. In the research, she pulled county records from Millard County and found her grandfather's 1978 harvest records. She ran the analysis herself with modern tools. Her grandfather's combined loss estimates had been, if anything, slightly conservative. The All-Crop 60, running at the settings he documented in his blue notebook, had been harvesting at a loss rate of roughly 1.8%, compared to an industry average in that period of 6 to 8% for self-propelled machines on dry-farmed, rocky terrain. She called Carl to tell him. Carl was quiet for a long time. He knew, he finally said, he knew to the bushel. I know, Elise said. He just never said. No, she said, he just did it. Let me pause here and ask you one last thing. How many times have you looked at something old, a machine, a method, a way of doing things, and assumed that newer meant better, that the thing being replaced was being replaced for good reason, and that anyone still using it was simply behind? Eldon Pruett was not a man who resisted progress. He'd installed irrigation pivots when his neighbors thought he was crazy. He read farming journals. He adopted new varieties of winter wheat as they became available. He was not a man who loved old things because they were old. He loved them when they were right. And the genius of what he did in the fall of 1978 was not stubbornness. It was precision. He knew something specific, a number, a loss rate, a mechanical truth about a particular machine on a particular kind of ground, and he applied it at the moment it mattered most. That is not nostalgia, that is expertise. We live in a world that moves very fast and tends to discard things, machines, knowledge, people before they are actually finished. A bank can put a number on a piece of land and call it final. A crowd can look at an old man in a dusty yard and calculate the outcome before the morning is over. A system can be designed, not maliciously perhaps, but effectively, to make the result feel inevitable. Eldon Pruett's answer to inevitability was a blue spiral notebook and a 30-year-old combine he spent 6 weeks rebuilding by hand. He was not waiting to be saved. He was not waiting for someone else to notice what he knew. He was not bitter at the bank or the system or the men in pressed collars who'd come to watch him lose. He was working. In the dark, before sunup, in the cold Utah mornings, moving at 5 miles an hour across ground his family had farmed for 2 generations, he was simply working. And when the gavel came down, he was ready. There's a phrase I come back to, thinking about men like Eldon Pruett. It's not a famous phrase from a famous person. It's the kind of thing an old farmer says while he's fixing a belt on a combine at 6 in the morning, and his son is writing it down in a notebook later because he knows it's worth keeping. The land doesn't care what the bank says it's worth. The land just needs to know if you're going to keep showing up. Eldon showed up for 43 years and then some. And the bank drove away. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. The Utah Code provision referenced reflects actual Utah foreclosure cure statutes from the period. Alice Chalmers' all-crop 60 combined specifications are accurate. Agricultural commodity prices cited reflect documented USDA market data from 1978. The sodium sulfate mineral industry in the Great Basin was active during this period. End card. If this story stayed with you, if you've known a man like Eldon or a farm like his, or a moment like that October morning, leave it in the comments. We read everyone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you know what to do. The Forgotten Farmer, new story every week.